Well, we're interrupting our normal broadcast to bring you live the protests that are taking place in the U.S. It has survived police crackdowns in Seattle and mass arrests in New York. Within just a few weeks, the Occupy Wall Street protest has become more than just a protest. It has become a movement. And now joining us on the line is author and historian Webster Tarpley, and also via Skype from Montreal is the director of Center for Research on Globalization, Professor Michel Chossudovsky. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us here on Press TV. Now, I would like to begin with you, Dr. Tarpley, if I can. A columnist with the New York Magazine has said regarding the focus of these protests, he said the protests, for all its incoherence, restore Wall Street to a central place in the economic narrative, adding that the protests may not have an agenda, but they do not need an agenda other than to return political focus onto Wall Street. Do you agree with that narrative?
No, not in the full sense. I think here's the idea. The protesters protesting now, finance capital, Wall Street, the zombie banks, the hedge fund hyenas, they're doing the right thing. A couple of years ago, we had the Tea Party movement, right-wing, alienated, ideologized, say big government is the enemy. That's baloney. The enemy is Wall Street and the power of the financiers who, after all, control the federal government through a Wall Street puppet like Obama. They own the Supreme Court. They own the Congress, and they are, in very crude terms, the center of evil in this society. So it's good. We welcome, obviously, the fact that there's now this protest movement. On the other hand, you've got to have an understanding of the mass strike dynamics. This is a mass strike, and it's got to get certain things done. And above all, it needs a coherent program of demands. The idea that we can get along without specific demands is absolutely fatuous. If you don't have demands, you don't have an identity. If you leave yourself as a blank slate, Obama will fill in the blank slate and claim that this is, after all, just something supporting him, because he's, of course, considered to be anti-Wall Street, even though he is their puppet. If you don't raise demands, take, for example, the question of a student loan amnesty. Cancel the $1 trillion of illegitimate debt that is crushing this youth generation. It's one of the things that have gotten them out into the streets. If you don't raise that demand, you can't force the media to discuss it and the Congress to pass it. If you don't talk about a 1% Wall Street sales tax on all of their transactions, then that demand will languish. One of the bright spots in this demonstration is that the nurses union has been raising the demand for this Wall Street sales tax or transaction tax. The big problem is that no demands have been made. And as a matter of fact, there's a doctrinaire kind of self-sabotage going on by the leaders of this, who are a very shadowy group. Some of them seem to be infiltrated. Some of them seem to be working for the Democratic Party or God knows what. They're hostile to the idea of raising these specific demands. And this is what has to change. Naturally, people from the Democratic Party are eager to prevent the formulation of demands, because serious demands would lead where the Democratic Party cannot follow. They would embarrass Obama. They would expose Obama as a Wall Street puppet. They would rip off the left cover of so many of these fakers. So I think it's an urgent question, because you have limited time. And when the leaders of this Wall Street demonstration get on television, they should not waste the few precious minutes they have praising their own idiotic model of consensus and general assemblies and all the rest, which is really just a way to waste time. They've discussed for 2 hours what to have for lunch. They discussed for 3 hours whether they should buy sleeping bags or sew them or knit them themselves. This is completely idiotic. In the meantime, they have no demands. Well, people ask, what do you stand for? Are you an anarchist? Are you a communist? Are you Ron Paul? Are you the Tea Party? Are you Obama? What are you? Without demands, you have no identity. You're just a blank slate.
All right, let me bring in Professor Chossudovsky into the conversation. Professor, how significant do you think is bringing Wall Street front and center to this debate?
Well, I share the view expressed by Dr. Webster Tarpley. Essentially, we have to find out who is behind this movement. There are a number of organizations, mainstream civil society organizations, which are funded by tax-free foundations, which in turn are linked up to to the powers of Wall Street. I think it is somewhat ironic that some of the patrons of this movement are the Wall Street tycoons, people who have enriched themselves through speculative transactions. I'm talking about Warren Buffett. Well, Warren Buffett has said he supports the movement. Ben Bernanke has also said he understands the nature of this protest movement. But I think what is at the heart of this movement, and I think essentially, yes, we have to look at the organizational structures, at the demands, but essentially we also have to look at the actors behind the global economic crisis and the Great Recession, which reached its peak in 2008, which is leading to mass unemployment, to the impoverishment of millions of people. And then we have to stay, well, what is the legitimacy of this system? Is Wall Street, are we dealing with bona fide market operations? Are we dealing with sheer criminality, using the instruments of speculative trade to appropriate the wealth of millions of people? Are we talking about the transfer of billions of dollars of tax revenues into the pockets of the Wall Street financial institutions through the bailout and through various other mechanisms? Are we going to discuss the issue of defense and the billions and billions of dollars which go into financing the wars in the Middle East, in North Africa, under the guise of responsibility to protect? All these are very important things, but they raise the question of legitimacy, not only in the political arena, but legitimacy in the corridors of Wall Street. Now, I should mention there are several groups, and they seem to be at cross purposes. One group says it's the Federal Reserve that we should be targeting, and the other group says, no, it's Wall Street which we should be targeting. This has added an element of confusion because Wall Street and the Federal Reserve is one and the same thing. The Federal Reserve is owned by the large Wall Street banks. It's not a public institution by any means. And in fact, what lies at the basis of a well-formulated mass movement is an understanding of how the system works, how people are enriching themselves at the expense of the 99%, and how you reverse the tide. You don't reverse the tide by saying, please, Mr. Warren Buffett, or please, Mr. Obama, we would like to introduce a tax. No, you say people in high office who are behind this agenda are illegitimate. They do not represent the people. They are acting on behalf of a very small segment of the population, which are the financiers, and they are complicit. And consequently, you have to remove them from office, and you have to start discussing major reforms in the financial apparatus. That is what I would see is required. And this movement is very spontaneous. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have a concrete organizational structure and understanding of how the economic system actually functions. And I think we can look back in history. We've had many of these protest movements which, in effect, become ritualized. And they become ritualized also because they're funded by foundations and then they're pushed in certain directions. They certainly represent a very important grassroots movement of discontent across America. But what the elites are doing is attempting to divide the people in their endeavors and to confuse matters and to prevent an analysis which will allow them to actually confront head-on the elites which are responsible for market manipulation and for the appropriation of people's savings.
Right, Dr. Tarpley, as Professor Sadowski mentioned there was an endorsement of these protests by Warren Buffett and even Bernanke. But do these endorsements actually matter, considering, for example, even Biden came out and said the rallies are happening primarily because, quote, the bargain has been breached with the American people and they have a right to be angry. Now, does this even matter, considering Joseph Biden and his counterparts represent the same system that they are complicit in breaching this contract that he spoke of?
Well, certainly you're right, and Professor Sadowski is quite right too. As long as you don't have a program of fighting demands, things that you are committed to fight for in the name and in the interest of the American people, then Obama, Biden can claim that you're really part of their cause. And ultimately, the misleaders, the infiltrators, the left liberals who are scurrying down there, the Michael Moores and so forth who are running down to lower Manhattan, their goal is to make this into the left wing of the Obama 2012 re-election campaign. I would also point to the endorsement by George Soros. This ought to tell us everything we need to know. The problem is the movement they've come up with a declaration which is not even an analysis. It's just a list of complaints. It's a cahier de doléances. It's just things that they don't like. Gives the impression that they're whining and they're complaining. We have to go beyond mere protest. Protest is for wimps. Revolutionaries are about taking power. If you want to take power, push aside the rotten Wall Street Democrats, Obama, push aside the rotten Wall Street reactionary Republicans, then you better have a fighting program that could actually put an end to the world economic depression, which is going on. Maybe I just put a few points that would fit in there. Dump Obama is a very important point. If they're completely silent on Obama, then what are they about? End the war in Libya. They don't bring that up because it would embarrass Obama. Cancel the student loans. Some of that is zombie bankers have made the loans. Let them eat the losses. Some of it can be paid for by the 1% Wall Street sales tax, which again is gathering some strength. If you want to reach out to the middle class, stop foreclosures. Have the new Fraser-Lemke Act stop all foreclosures in the United States for 5 years or the duration of the crisis. For workers, for children, for old people, protect the social safety net, the few programs that we have left over from the New Deal and the Great Society. We have to nationalize the Fed. I think the end the Fed demand is completely misguided. If it means just abolish it, that means all of the power goes back to the zombie bankers, to the people at J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank and the rest. What we would need to finance a recovery is $1 trillion to begin with, a tranche of $1 trillion of 0% federal credit. Start building infrastructure. We would have to rebuild the interstate highway system, rebuild the national passenger freight and commuter rail systems, rebuild the water and canal systems, rebuild schools, hospitals, public buildings. In other words, a combination of the Roosevelt WPA and PWA. The goal ought to be 30 million new productive jobs at union wages, which would basically bring this country to full employment for the first time since 1945. Working people don't need to hear students in lower Manhattan telling them how bad it is. They know this better than they do. Their problem is, how do you find a job? How can you afford to see a doctor? How can you stop a fraud closure on your house? How can you buy groceries? How can you pay a tuition bill? How can you get out from under this terrific and crushing debt that the kids have, right? $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 for a very dubious postmodernist education. So I think the urgency is political education, and that means concretely a fighting program, because a farmer can look at them. We have labor, women, farmers, all kinds of population groups. What they're interested in seeing is a new powerful social force on the scene that will fight for these national interests that transcend simply some narrow group in the society. And, of course, if the system can give radical reform, that's fine. Otherwise, then revolution, this might indeed emerge. But it'll start, above all, from the idea of attempting to provide solutions for these urgent problems, because civilization itself is in danger. We're in a breakdown crisis. We're in a disintegration of the entire world monetary system. We have banking system. We have all kinds of people saying we're basically on the verge of a chain reaction, cascading bankruptcy of the main European and U.S. banks. That would be the second and third waves of this current economic depression. So there's a lot of urgency to get the political education done. And these mushheads like Michael Moore and Noam Chomsky, who'll go down there and say, "Oh, we're so happy. Don't change anything that you're doing." This is basically to say, stay generic, stay vague, so that Obama can make you into useful idiots.
Right. Professor Chossudovsky, regarding the protest movement, President Obama said the furor would, quote, express itself politically in the 2012 elections and beyond. Since the protests are not focused as one would have them be, do you see the movement evolving into something like the Tea Party, further polarizing American politics, or will this movement actually come to a point of realization that change simply cannot come from within the system?
Well, it's very difficult to know how this movement is going to evolve, but there are a number of issues I'd like to mention. First of all, this is not the first time there have been mass rallies in the United States of America. There have been some very large rallies which have occurred and which have received absolutely no media coverage, including anti-war movements and so on. Now, it just so happens that this mass rally is tainted with the public relations media coverage, which normally gives a certain element of suspicion, because the extensive war crimes committed in Libya were never covered by the media. The mass rallies which took place against the war were never covered by the media. And now all of a sudden we have this rally with public figures, Michael Moore and so on, and run by public relations firms where there is coverage. And one has to ask oneself a big question. The same was true with the World Social Forum. There was a lot of coverage of the World Social Forum. There was a lot of folklore. There was a certain ritual of dissent. And I think what we have to understand is that we cannot rely on the support of the mainstream media to wage a meaningful reform and revolution in American society. The fact that the mainstream media is hyping this event, for me, provides the wrong signal. There have been other movements in America. There have been grassroots movements at the municipal level. There have been labor movements as well, which have been barely covered. And this movement is spontaneous, and it's funded by certain organizations, which in turn are supported by foundations. I think one of the key issues, if we're talking about solutions to the current crisis, we have to understand that the solution which is being proposed almost universally by the heads of state and heads of government of Western countries, including the United States, including Canada, in fact, that solution ultimately is the cause of the crisis, because the solution is essentially the neoliberal agenda. It is to implement austerity measures, to have debt reduction, to cut the deficit, and at the same time, of course, this means that the economy goes downwards with layoffs in the public sector, cuts in social programs, so that the solution to this crisis, which is cut, austerity measures, deregulation, privatization, ultimately is the cause of further collapse, further economic and social collapse. And that mechanism is very important. And so that the key demand should be to question the whole framework of economic and social policy, where this solution is proposed and is part of a consensus. And that once that consensus is broken, then we can start building alternatives. But we have to say that this consensus is based on a falsehood, it's based on a lie, that the media is sustaining that lie, and ultimately, once we break the consensus that neoliberalism is the solution to the crisis, we have the basis for formulating all the things which Dr. Webster Tarpley mentioned, the importance of creating jobs, rehabilitating social programs, and we have to do away with the myth which prevails it prevails that ultimately if we can't finance these various programs, it's because we lack means, we don't have resources. Well, this is of course a falsehood. The resources are there, but the mechanism for allocating resources has been twisted by the financial establishment, and the revenues of the state have been siphoned off. We are in a massive fiscal crisis because essentially you have two categories of expenditure, which are the financing of the war on the one hand and the financing of the various bailouts from Bush on to Obama, which take up practically the totality of government revenue, which means that every single other program, social program, transport, infrastructure has to be financed through debt formation. And
all right, let me pick up on this. Dr. Tarpley,
the legitimacy of the creditors.
Dr. Tarpley, picking up on the point Professor Chusodowski just made, the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City writes that we write so that all people who feel wronged by corporate forces of the world can know that we are your allies, adding that no true democracy is attainable when the process is determined by an economic power. If this by itself becomes the focus of this movement, considering how ingrained American social, political, and socio-economic system is in corporate interest, can this movement achieve anything substantial at all?
Look, the declaration you just quoted is hopelessly generic. It's a bunch of slogans. Again, it's a bunch of complaints. They have all kinds of things in there. Animal rights. They have typical preoccupations of rich elitists, right, on the radical ecological side. It's a mishmash. It's not coherent. It's not an economic recovery program, and it's not a program for mass struggle. I would say the point of intervening in this is to turn this into a nationwide general strike, including labor, including farmers, including the military, including everybody, and use that to break the consensus. But there's no divide, there's no dichotomy between demands that obviously abolish and demolish the present system and breaking some kind of a consensus. Right now we had demonstrations today in 800 U.S. cities. The question is hegemony. Who's going to be leading those? Is it going to be Michael Moore, the millionaire predator and exploiter of all this, who uses these people as props for self-promotion? Is it going to be a famous figure of impotence and misleadership like Noam Chomsky, who doesn't have a programmatic demand left in his body and never did? Is it going to be Michael Hudson, the left Democratic Party economist, who says they don't need demand? Rather, I would say this: one of the biggest problems that's preventing demands from coming forward is this question of the assembly, right? The consensus method. It turns out that this was imposed by a secret steering committee of people. Some of them were students coming from Spain. I wonder what kind of students they were. Maybe they were brought over by the intelligence community. This group claims that they want to imitate the Indignados of Madrid. The Madrid Indignados are the biggest failures in Europe. They've accomplished absolutely nothing. They couldn't even bring down the IMF agent Zapatero because he operates under socialist left cover, similar to Obama. They don't get anything decided. The method comes from an anarchist crackpot by the name of Peter Gelderloos,
right.
And that's supposedly the Karl Marx of the new revolution. Well, nobody wants this. Working people are a million years ahead of that declaration. They don't need to know that it's bad. They know it's bad.
All right, on that note, I'm going to have to cut you off, Dr. Tarpley. I'm afraid we have run out of time. That was author and historian Webster Griffin Tarpley. Also joining us via Skype from Montreal was Professor Michel Chusodowski, Director of the Center for Research on Globalization. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us here on Press TV. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with the world news in full in just about 2.5 minutes' time. Don't go away.